on the impact of refugee returns on peace and security in the Horn of Africa. Returning to stability, refugees return in the Great Lake region. The team is really a team of utmost importance if we want to see conflict de-escalating in Africa, but particularly if we want to actually avoid relapse into conflict.
This meeting, I think, as the first activity of the year, also creates a bridge between last year's theme around refugees, returnees, and IDPs, and durable solutions for displacement, to this year's theme, focusing on silencing of the guns. As captured in the report, returns is always seen as the main solution for displacement. This report looks at that narrative and bridges the gap, or looks at the gaps between what is intended at a policy level when it comes to returns and what actually happens on the ground.
The African Union places enormous amount of significance or importance to this issue. The 1969 OAU Convention governing specific aspects of refugees, it's an important indicator of how the AU takes this so seriously.
Top-down approach. It's high time to look at reintegration of refugees into all the livelihoods as a developmental issue. And the concept of bringing development as the way to sustain the return is not a new concept, but it's being now used apparently by the World Bank to make sure that the debate on development starts when the planning of return starts. It's also about mobilizing resources at national level to be able to fund those quick win initiatives that allows ownership to take place, but also allow returnees in a more sustainable way to recover their livelihood. Because it's, at the end of the day, it's about land issue. It's about property rights. It's about the dignity of the people who have lost everything, but also it's about recovery, a moral recovery at the end of the day. I heard a number of case studies today about situations that are very particular to certain countries: Burundi, South Sudan, Eritrea, DRC, Eastern DRC. And I think those examples just help us who are in academia, decision makers, even practitioners who are giving us those examples, actually helped us to understand what we are not doing right. The Institute for Peace and Security Studies of Addis Ababa University organizes such a platform to bring decision makers, practitioners, academia together to reflect on some of the practices in the peace and security agenda in general. And this topic is at the heart of what we do on a daily basis.
It's a human rights issue. No one should be forced to return. It is in line with the OAU convention, the 1951 convention. The OAU convention is a regional instrument, and most of the African countries have already signed and ratified this convention. It's important to ensure that we comply with it. If we involve refugees or IDPs in a consultative manner and ensuring this process is voluntary, then that return will be sustainable. How are you going to silence the gun? Bring the warring parties to the negotiation table.
Return and reintegration must be planned well. And if it is planned well, I think it can benefit all the stakeholders. Returnees, when they are in exile, they learn a lot of things. They learn of new things. When they are in refugee camps, services sometimes are more accessible. You find that you go to a refugee camp, let's say Uganda, where I come from. In refugee camps, you find that there are facilities, there are amenities there. You'll find water is near. A clinic is next to the door. But now you want to, when the refugees to go back home, they return to the same conditions to which they fled.
The African Union is an intergovernmental organization comprising 55 member states. Intergovernmental, 55 member states. And the theme that we focused on last year on forced displacement and humanitarian crisis, you'll agree with me, cannot be resolved sustainably by governments alone. It requires a comprehensive approach that involves a multiplicity of stakeholders, state and non-state actors alike. Actors like IRRI and IPSS come in handy in that kind of partnership. That is why we welcome this kind of workshops that you have organized today to address the theme of the year, because it reinforces that partnership between state and non-state actors. We welcome this kind of initiatives by IPSS and IRRI, and we encourage the two institutions and others to continue this work and also collaborate with us at the African Union Commission. I come from the Department of Political Affairs. We will be more than happy to work with you.
We went to the ground, collected information about returns. It is often fronted as a durable solution for displacement situations. The purpose of then going to document the reality of returns was to push back on the assumption that once people have gone back, then it's over. How do you ensure the durability or sustainability of solutions like returns? One of the key issues that was raised during this policy brief was around the imperative for infusing development right into the preparations, the national policies, the conversations around peace negotiations, but also around preparation for returns. People cannot return to places where they're unable to sustain themselves. What about the people in protracted situations of displacement who have grown up, have been born and grown up in the country of asylum, and have lived those lives and have very little emotional, cultural connection with the places to which they are being returned to? Shouldn't they have alternative options than being forced back to this context? A lot of times when people are speaking about issues of return, they think about return in terms of only access to land and agricultural means. But sometimes refugees come back when they've learned other skills. They have other forms of education. I think it's time we thought about issues of return from a people-centered paradigm. The land is not always there waiting. When they left, sometimes other people have come and occupied the land. And when people are going back to supposedly where they came from, they find themselves in conflict with the people who then occupied the land. And that is a big problem. We're facing new challenges of climate change. So where there's climate change, agriculture may no longer be as viable in the areas where they came from as they were when they left. And so we need to be very systematic and very deliberate when we're talking about durable solutions for people who find themselves in situations of displacement.
Returnees are coming back generally to the same areas where they left, but soon after that, because of problems of reintegration and problems of livelihoods, they tend to migrate to other places. What we have observed is that the limited, especially assistance, especially with the return package, which is meant to last for 3 months, but which basically goes for barely 1 month and is just completed, and some sporadic assistance by NGOs, but which is not really consistent at all. And so this has brought in a lot of conflict and resentments from the host community, which is also vulnerable, especially following the economic hardship which the country is going through as a result of the crisis, and as a result also of the sanctions that were imposed upon the government. Unfortunately, even during the assistance in Burundi for the refugees that are coming back today, most of the assistance has been carved on agriculture. And yet, over 30% of Burundians and more than that of those that are coming back do not have land in the first place. They are landless. So when you find solutions that are based on land, and the land which is not available, and the people who do not have land, then it becomes even very, very difficult. So less land-intensive activities should be promoted in order to diversify ways of having ends meet.
Discussions was the result actually of insecurity arising in South Sudan and also penetrating the refugee camp of Nyori, that people actually all of a sudden just massively came back.
When the FPR won in Rwanda, those of 59 that were not considered as Congolese went to Rwanda, and a few years later it was Congo that was in war with Laurent Désiré Kabila, and they came in this region, and some of them say we're going to conquer the country, but it's the Rwandese are coming to conquer the countries.
I think it's very important to say that there should maybe be more attention for collaboration, communication, coordination between all these different kinds of actors in humanitarian operations on the ground, and to really ensure that you have an inclusive approach. I think it's very important to have an organization to return people, to know, first of all, what is happening in exile, what political dynamics are there. It's not just about returning people to their country of origin, but to take into account this whole process that is taking place in displacements during a return process.
I like this theme, silencing the gun. I'm going to make this link. In order to advance the African Union should take into account the geopolitical and geostrategic dimension in this region. It is quite necessary, if we want to silence the guns, we need to look into the mechanism as to how we can imagine a type of regional integration, that is both from the top and from the bottom.
How land is the big question mark when you talk about returnees. How do you make sure that within a space where you still have insecurity, you're still thinking of making sure that people return safe home? It has to be a voluntary process. And that makes it very difficult because it goes with all the political dynamics that are around having a voluntary process. And usually with insecurity, people do not want to go back. Government, as it was said, has to make sure that we have infrastructure for peace that can accompany those returnees and make sure that they follow the flux of migration.
The presidents have committed themselves. I don't know whether it is us, the implementers, who are a problem. So the member states must work hard to ensure that the underlying conditions that forced originated refugees to flee are addressed before they come back.
Every human being is a citizen of this world, and everybody is entitled to live. Of course, it has to be regulated, but everybody is entitled to live anywhere in the world, and also to own property, so the property rights.
There's often a gap between policy by policymakers and policy for beneficiaries of those policies. Young people on the continent were more aware of UN resolutions and not aware of similar resolutions or decisions by AU and AU organs, even though they are closer to them. Also begin to figure out the programs within and amongst our several institutions and figure out how the interface can work such that we can deliver as a development objective rather than as, so the UN does its thing, the AU does its thing, the Great Lakes does its thing, ECOWAS does its thing, but we're serving the same people and the same objective.
Talking about silencing the guns. When we talk about refugees and returnees in the context of peace and security, I am looking at it through two main lenses, which is one, a human security lens, and second, the economic security lens.
At the very highest level of political leadership, you have this political willingness, but then in terms of the disconnect, how did those, at the very high level, political commitments that were made from IGAD Plan of Action, then have they translated into actual practice? Kenya, who was hosting, of course, is my president, but then still we have an incumbent policy. So when you go to the DAB and Kakuma, whereas they have committed themselves at the highest political level to be able then to have a very conducive environment, but then that has not translated into better freedoms for the Somali refugees or the South Sudanese who are in Kakuma.
We have to think about sustainable integrations. We have also to think about, and I agree with, have sustainable livelihood. And how can we, and the main question for me is, how can we transform and translate those concerns into pragmatic actions, into integrated action plans? We should first to perceive them as actors, not as assisted.
I think sustaining livelihood and sustaining integration of returnees means the local level. Start with the local level. Local communities, local institutions, local projects. Bring the development paradigm early in the conversation. Not wait until you set up everything, all the infrastructure to talk about development. It has to be early in the conversation.
This dimension has to be taken into consideration so that we can manage the root causes and the origins of this displacement. So these causes are linked to what threatens security, be it food security, human security, climatic security, and its impacts would be peace, security, it could be conflicts within the communities or the creation of armed groups, because they don't know boundaries, these things. And I would like to stress on that. It is good to find responses, be it at the local level through public policies to reintegrate these refugees, but it is also better to take into consideration the causes at the regional level, and the interregional level, and the transboundary.
The skills that refugees do get when they're in the camps. Return is not the solution. I mean, I know most governments, and my government of Kenya is one of those that really loves it, and they only say that the only solution for the Somalia question in Kenya, Somali refugees, is for them to go back. But just taking someone from across the border, what we need to start to think and to invest more is how do we make sure that it's not just about the return part, but it's also sustainable reintegration. So thinking about the long-term perspective. One of the biggest challenges that even with the current voluntary repatriation program, if you go to UNHCR or even the agencies that supported the many 8,000 that we've seen, if you ask them, what was the follow-through? Can you be able to actually point out to some individual households who are refugees in Kenya or in the DAB who've been able to go back, but they've been able to be sustainably reintegrated currently in the cities by Doha, Mogadishu, or Kismayu? You don't find that kind of data. Monitor the progress and make linkages, because the problem is we drop them into these various different cities but did not do the follow-through or the thinking that the needs that they're coming back with, they are more of the developmental approach.
Why should we be forcing people to go back? Does it mean that when you become a refugee, you lose your regional citizenship or your continental citizenship? What is it about being a refugee, which is supposed to be a status of protection, that has become a status of exceptionalism? So you're refused all the other rights when you're a refugee other than being a refugee. And I think this is one of the things that came up in our discussions last year about the that we need to shift and stop talking about refugees as charity, as something that we do because we are good people, so we're helping these poor people, and shift it to a position of rights. A lot of times refugees are not even able to access basic rights, even to complain about the situation they find themselves in, whether in the camps or in situations of return. It's considered that they're being political. And so how do we shift back to allow refugees and returnees also to have some agency and have some say in the situations that impact on them?
How about economic integration? So slow and phased out approach towards full-scale integration, in the sense that we begin from a point of saying that actually refugees are not a burden. They have a lot of dividends to be able to contribute even to the local economy.
Return and integration must always be voluntary and must be sustainable. It is not enough to do one thing, but it has to be a way in which the migrant has to be followed to the extent to ensure that they have gone back to become productive members of the society they are integrated in.
One recommendation would be that every reintegration process should genuinely involve the beneficiaries, both the refugees and the host communities.
It should not always be a condition to return to where you came from.
My recommendation is basically to ask for commitment from our leaders in the continent to apply good governance in terms of applying the policies that they accept or discuss into practical or to the lower level of leadership. So for instance, my sister here spoke about guidelines, but if there isn't good governance, then those guidelines would not be applied.
To ensure that there is involvement of security actors in refugee policy-making processes, so they understand their role in terms of protection of refugees in the host country, but also in the countries where they return.